Hi, I'm Pat Fiume. I've been a realtor for over 30 years. I'm a host of the American Dream Show. Welcome to my show, Is This for Real Estate? Welcome back. I'm here with Grant Gikas from NSIS. Grant, welcome.
Pat, good to see you. You always look like you're getting younger every time.
Thank you. I just had a birthday. That was good to hear. I'm going backwards now, right?
Only wish.
So tell our audience what your business is and what you do.
One of my main parts of my business is doing tank searches for individuals and companies that are purchasing property, residential or commercial. And then another part of my business is utility locating for basically commercial clients. If you've ever driven up and down the Turnpike or the Parkway, all those Sunoco stations and rest areas that they're rebuilding, I've done all the utility locating associated with the Sunoco stations.
Are they those little flags you see too?
That and the red and the all the different paint marks on the ground. That's
the spray paint. Yeah, I've seen that.
That's the utility.
That's
locating.
what that is. Okay. Yeah.
But for realtors, I'm doing the tank searches.
Okay. And I know I've used you many times with clients. That's how I got to meet you. So what would you do if somebody buys a house and they're worried about an underground tank? What's the process, I guess, other than me giving them your name
right.
to use?
Well, it definitely is a process. I tell people that I always need to get into the property so I can look for clues. I might even have to go and dive into a crawl space if I can fit, and try to see if I can see some old lines. Or you go in the basement, you look for old lines, or maybe patches in the
concrete or the floor. Yeah.
And if I do find those kind of things, then or a vent pipe sticking up.
Oh, that's a dead giveaway.
That's a dead giveaway.
Yeah.
But I actually have equipment that I can clamp to it and broadcast a frequency on with
that's
a radio
amazing.
station, and another receiver that I can go and trace this line to see where it came from.
That's amazing.
Yeah, sometimes you find a tank there, and sometimes the tank's gone, but at least you know where it was. If somebody wanted to test the environmental condition of the earth, even if they're really worried, then they could test.
I've had a couple people be worried about stuff like that.
It's a process. That's if I find the lines, I can trace them. Then you go with the metal detector. That's what everybody has when most times people order a tank sweep. In my case, I tell them I'm doing a tank search.
Right. Big difference.
It's a difference.
Big difference.
You'll go with the metal detector, and you're going to look for large pieces of metal outside the footprint of the house, obstructions of scanning. So if there's like a big pile of stuff piled up against the house, that's not too good. Or metallic interfering objects. You try to look for a big piece of metal. If you don't find one, we're doing good. A lot of times you'll find that there's a patio that's been built with steel reinforcement.
Absolutely. Yeah, like if we're going to put a hot tub or something on it, they have to put the rebarb in it.
Yeah, and you know, it's sort of from one town to the next sometimes.
It's different.
I guess depending on the construction department. But what do you do if the walkway or the patio has rebar in it? Then a metal detector is useless or worthless. I can't, a person couldn't tell what's under there. So I actually have other equipment called a ground penetrating radar, where I can go and scan the areas that have steel reinforcement. Or if I did find a big piece of metal out in the yard, we can scan that with this radar machine. And I'm looking for a certain shape. Right. I'm not going to set all the bells and whistles off if it doesn't look like a tank. Right. But if it looks like a tank, then, I'll let you know.
I actually had a deal that you helped save. Sammy did a flip, one of my buyers who does flips, and he was selling the property. It was at the end of a street. There was a storm drain at the end of the property. It was on a cul-de-sac. It was like a dead end. The home inspector, and then they hired a tank sweep who swore it was an underground oil tank. And you said it's a utility, thing. So utility drain or something from the street. Right. And they fought us tooth and nail. The whole deal almost blew up over, but you were able to give him the documentation and prove what it was. So sometimes we get utility issues or things that are not the normal things that people just assume are an oil tank or an underground tank, and they're not.
Right. If they only use the metal detector,
They're gonna,
then they might. The next thing you might say is, "Well, for so many $100, we'll come and dig it up for you."
right,
Where in sometimes the radar will actually save you from having to do that. I'll always tell you, if you really want to know what it is, dig it up by
Right.
all means. But if it looks like a tank, you'll know. If it doesn't look like a tank, I'm just going to say it doesn't look like a tank. Dig it up if you want to know exactly what it is.
I actually had an interesting one a few years ago. I don't know if it was you or they had somebody, I can't remember, but I think we might have called you in. It was an underground, no, you were on vacation, so you refer to somebody else.
Okay.
There was wires, because the dead giveaway, the wires for the oil tank were in the basement. It was in Cherry Hill and Springbrook. And when they were built, there was an option for to either have it above ground, underground, or outside, or in the basement. And they found copper coils in the ground next to the house. And they were so deep that they had to get a backhoe and dig out like 80 feet, 40 feet deep or something. And they're literally at the bottom of the hole was the coil wound up. So I guess originally the builder was going to be putting the oil tank underground, and the seller at the last minute decided to put it above ground. But I think you were on vacation. You referred us to somebody else.
Right.
It was in Springbrook, because back then that was during the sets. Because that was my next question. Like the '70s oil embargo time, we saw a lot of oil tanks coming in, and they were not as good as the older oil tanks. Because I've had some real nasty transactions with some of these '70s more aluminum oil tanks.
Yeah. You know what? I grew up on a farm and lived in a farmhouse, and we had the same oil tank in the ground forever.
Right.
And so I went to school and I got into this business, and I was like, told my mom, we got to get rid of that tank. It must have leaked by now. It turned out it was a tank from the 1930s.
Yeah.
And it was made out of steel, as thick, as thick as your thumb. So luckily it never leaked. But I think
some of the newer ones
the transition was probably after World War II.
Yes.
When it started getting thinner. And then then the situation is, if people are running electrical wires near a tank, those strip electrons out of the steel, and the tanks can get corroded a little faster. Or if they're sitting in water, and if they're thin gauge steel, they're going to leak after 15, 20 years, if they're under stress like that.
Right.
But there is an issue with the age of the tank.
Yeah, that can make a big difference. And I've been seeing ones now that look like they're square outside. I think, is that the new tanks?
Yeah, they call them Roth tanks.
I didn't know what they were called.
Double wall.
Okay.
And I think people, if they bought them originally from the Roth dealer, they get a pretty good insurance policy that's part of the cost of it. So,
do you have anything to do with remediation of tanks, or is that do you refer somebody else if they are found, or removal?
Yeah, I have no conflict. I'm looking for things, tanks or utility lines. I can refer you to somebody because before I was in this business, I actually used to be an environmental consultant working as an oversight for insurance adjusters. So we worked on lots of residential and commercial, and I met a lot of contractors. Right. So, I can probably give you a reference.
Okay. As a matter of fact, my son Lou bought a house in Merchantville that was we thought it was an English tutor. It's actually a German tutor, which is very rare. And I had you come in. My son didn't want to do a tank sweep. And I said, Lou, because I had a house years ago in Haddon Heights that they found 4 tanks. There was one in the basement, one in the crawl space, one underground that was leaking, and then they found a 4th one in the front yard. And I told my son this story. I said, I paid for it. I think, because I was like, it was my son. He had an old coal chute and everything in his house. It was that old, it was a very old house. But I just wanted that comfort and peace of mind for myself, for my son, because I said to him, if you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix a house up because he bought a fixer-upper because he's in construction, you're wasting your money if it's contaminated. you know.
It eats into any profits.
Yeah,
for sure.
definitely can. So you've been doing this a long time. What's the story you tell at cocktail parties, or your one funny story you tell people?
Right. Yeah. There's not a lot of funny stories, but there are cautionary tales.
Okay.
And one of them happened to be down by the shore in Margate, and you topped it. You said you found 4 tanks on property. Well, in this property, I found 3 underground tanks.
Wow.
And everybody said, "No way."
That's what happened with mine. Yeah.
And sure enough, when they went to dig them up, they said, "You got it."
Yeah, that was crazy, because the one I had, the 4th one, was in the crawl space on its side.
Uh-huh.
But the other 3 were underground.
Right.
All 3. Yeah, they were all underground. I actually had another one in Maple Shade years ago. Actually, the house has not sold yet. The woman passed away. She went into a nursing home, was selling the house to fund her nursing home or assisted living. She had to move back in because her tank leaked so bad. And as they went down the driveway, they found a second one in the front yard. Then they went along the driveway, because the 2 driveways abutted each other, with the neighbor who had just bought the house, was a young couple. They didn't have an oil tank sweep done, and there was a creek behind the house, like a block and a half away. And it was it was a nightmare. They actually, when they got to the property line, the oil was through the roof. Mm-hmm. And here the neighbor, who was a young couple, didn't do an oil tank sweep, and the tank was actively leaking, like they were putting oil in it.
Yes.
It was contaminating the house I had.
Right, or you get the 2
cross-contamination.
spills are commingling somewhere.
And they didn't have any money, and it took, actually, Abby Kohler, the attorney who I had on as my first guest on this show, handled that whole thing for me. And she asked me about them a couple of weeks ago. I said, no, actually, the guy's name was Scott. He's got the house, and when he retires, he's going to move back to it, because that's the house he grew up in. But there are stories out there about some interesting things, that's for sure. Where's the weirdest place you ever found an underground tank? Any weird places? Just curious.
Well, I think you hit on that already. Sometimes they'll be maybe underneath a porch.
Mm-hmm. I've had that.
Or down by the shore again in Margate. They used to put them underneath the front steps. And those are hard to find, because the only way to find them is get in the crawl space and see the wire, the tubing actually go there, the fuel lines. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you'll never find it.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a lot of good information for people, and I thank you for being a guest.
Thank you, Pat.
You're welcome.